Hi everyone and welcome to this week's video. This week I thought we'd have a chat about direct sowing because it's not something I've talked very much about on my videos so far. You'll have seen that I have started an awful lot of things over the last couple of years in the greenhouse, and I've either overwintered them or I've started them off in late winter, early springtime, brought them on in the greenhouse and then planted them out. But I do some direct sowing too, but only of particular seeds. So we're going to have a chat today about the kinds of seeds that I do sow directly outside, why I do a bit of direct sowing, and why I don't do direct sowing with some of my other seeds. So some are brilliant outside, they get on really well. Others I like to give a bit of protection and start indoors. So first of all, let's have a chat about why it's good to direct sow. So what are the advantages of direct sowing? Why should you bother doing it? It is avoiding a lot of different steps for yourself. So if you grow indoors, you are having to use seed compost, fill trays up, you're having to sow your seeds, put humidity domes on them, quite often put them on some kind of heat mat, using electricity to get the seeds started. Then remembering to get them off the heat mats and humidity domes off and grow them on in cooler conditions with lots of light so they don't get leggy. Potting them on and pricking them out at the right stages so that they've got room to grow, and getting enough ventilation into the greenhouse, watering at the right stages. You're in and out the greenhouse looking at these baby plants all the time and giving them the best care that you can. So it's very, very labour intensive to get these little seeds right through from the stage of germination through to getting them out and planted in the garden. So direct sowing, much quicker. Sow the seeds in these drills that you make, cover them over. Might need to water them if it's dry weather, but you're in Scotland, the rain quite often does that for me. A little bit of thinning out, but they're already in the place that they're going to flower. So largely your work is taken away from you. So that is fantastic reason to direct sow. So another reason that direct sowing is great is because some seeds actually do better if they are sowed outside. The plants tend to do better. There's less disturbance of their roots. So we'll talk in a minute about some of the seeds that I do like to direct sow because they prefer that to being indoor sown. They've got very long tap roots. They don't like root disturbance. And so being sown in the place that they're going to flower means that they have the least disturbance possible. They'll grow into nice, healthy, strong plants for you. So one of the advantages as well of direct sowing is these little plants put their roots down when they have germinated from seeds, and they've got lots of room for these little roots to stretch out in the soil in their final flowering place. Whereas if you've started them indoors, then sometimes your pots can get a little bit pot bound. Their roots just fill up the pot and they're too big for it, and they really need to be outside, but it's maybe not been the ideal time to get them out. And so that is a slight disadvantage there, that their growth inside can start to stall a little bit if they're ready to get outside and you've just not been able to do it. And the other thing is that if you've got an indoor plant, you have to make sure that it's hardened off properly and used to the outside before you get it in the garden. And if you miss this crucial step, then they can get a bit of transplant shock, and that means that it can really stall in its growth for a while. And you won't have that with your plants that were direct sown because they've been used to the conditions outside all along, right from the beginning. So it is definitely an advantage to direct sow some seeds to avoid having that problem with transplant shock that you might have with your indoor sown plants. So there are some disadvantages as well to direct sowing. If you grow indoors, you've got a lot more control over what's going on. It's much easier to individually sow out seeds. You can look after them a lot better. You don't have the weather influencing your seeds. So if there was a sudden big deluge of rain, it might just wash all those seeds away outside and you wouldn't get them germinating, or they'd come up in the wrong place when they did. The other thing that you're contending with outside is that it might be too cold to germinate. So you might have thought, oh, it's April now, fantastic, the soil's warming up, we'll sow some seeds directly outside, and then the next week the weather suddenly changes, it's back into winter again. And that can happen in Scotland in springtime. It's very, very variable weather, and you often are lulled into that false sense of security that spring has come, the sun is out, it's all good. Get direct sowing and then yeah, it does, it just changes back to winter again in a second. So you might end up then having a delay in your flowers because you've got all these seeds in the soil and it's just too cold for them to germinate. Whereas if you'd done it indoors, you'd got a head start and they germinated quickly for you and you could control things a little bit better there. So one of the other disadvantages of direct sowing is that you have got insects and birds outside. So if, for example, sunflower seeds are quite a precious seed, they're quite expensive to me, and I will always start them off indoors because of the birds coming to get them. I mean, the way around that is that you could net over or fleece over where you have done your seed sowing, and that would keep the birds off. But the other thing that we've got is slugs and snails, and as soon as you get little germinated seedlings, quite often they can just be taken out by slugs. So again, if you're sowing indoors, then you have more control over that. You can germinate your seeds, get little seedlings, grow them into sturdy plants, and then when you put them outside, they are more robust against attack by slugs. So for some of my more precious seeds, I definitely would start them off indoors. So things like zinnias and sunflowers would germinate quickly and really well from the outside, but I prefer to start them off indoors where it's really to keep away from these pests and bird damage. So just from experience as well, I have found that if I'm direct sowing and it's later on in the year, so it's more towards May and June time, or even at that autumn sowing stage in late August, the soil tends to be drier and I don't tend to have as many slug problems as I do early on in springtime. It seems to be a lot worse then when the soil is damp from lots of spring showers. So I would say that that's another reason for direct sowing later on in the season rather than very early, because there is less slug damage to the new seedlings then, and I'm better off doing indoor sowing in March time because that is when I get most slug damage outside. So one of the other disadvantages of direct sowing is the weeds. Your little seedlings that germinate out there are in direct competition with any weed seeds that have also germinated at the same time, and so they're both competing for the same nutrients, same space and the light, and sometimes the weeds might outcompete those little seedlings of yours, and if you've sown them indoors then you don't have that competition from the weeds. It's a much more controlled environment. Having said that, if you have really prepared your beds well beforehand and made sure that they are weed free, then you've got a head start on it and you can generally keep on top of the weeds as long as you're checking the beds and you are getting rid of any larger weeds when you do find them. But it is a small disadvantage to direct sowing is that there is always going to be that competition from weeds out there. So it's completely up to yourself really. You can see that there are advantages and disadvantages to sowing your seeds outdoors or indoors, and I think really what you have to do is some of it you do indoors. You choose particular seeds that you want to do, maybe first batches are indoors, and then you choose particular ones that you think are going to do better outside, and you choose the time of year when they're going to do the best for you there. They're going to be most successful. So I think my recommendation is don't do all of it direct sowing, don't do all of it indoors, do a little bit both. Right, so now that we've had a chat about the advantages and disadvantages of direct sowing seeds, let's go down into the flower patch and we'll have a look at me doing some direct sowing of some Phacelia seeds. So this week the weather has turned absolutely lovely. It is nice and sunny now, it's starting to warm up, you can feel spring is in the air, and this is the time that it's good to start some direct sowing. So I do start a lot of things here in Zone 8B in Scotland indoors, as you'll know from seeing all of my greenhouse videos, but actually some seeds prefer to be direct sown, and once the soil is warm enough and we've got into springtime, then it's a good time to start having a go at this. And it's also much easier with succession sowings once the soil's warmer to put new batches on outside rather than the greenhouse where by that time it's too hot. So today I'm going to show you a few of my favourite ones for growing directly into the beds outside. So if I'm direct sowing in the garden, I don't need too many different things to get started. I have got some twine here and some garden canes and some snips to cut the twine, and that is just so that I can make a nice straight line so that I know where I'm going to sow, rather than having it a bit wiggledy and having little seedlings coming up in random places. So it's much easier if you can make a straight line. I've got the trowel so that I can just make the furrow for the seeds to go into. Got a watering can because I am just going to make sure that I've watered before I sow the seeds. If you water afterwards, you'll just simply wash the seeds away, so it's easier to get the soil damp before you do. And gardening gloves as well, because some of the seeds it is better to handle with gloves just in case they are a little bit of an irritant to your hands. So how do I know what time of year to direct sow into the beds? Well, for me, March would be a little early. April, I can start to think about it outside, and from then on, the soil should be warm enough for things to germinate easily. But you can test by putting the back of your hand on the soil, and if it feels really cold to the touch, then it's unlikely that things will germinate well, and you might want to hold off for a couple of weeks and then test it again. But this is feeling fairly warm now, and I think things will germinate in that. Before I start direct sowing my flower seeds into the beds, I need to make sure that the area is weed free. And I don't dig over my beds each year. I mulch on top of them with compost that I have made in the garden or I've got locally. And that means that there is less damage to the soil structure, so it's better for the garden. But the odd seeds as weeds can get going, and you want to just remove them if you can. So this is looking pretty good, but as you can see down here, there's a weed there. So I'll just pull that one out. We don't want that one in there when we're going to be sowing our flower seeds. We'll just have a look around and see if we can see any more, but it's looking pretty good. And it's pretty fine, the texture of the soil as well. There's not any great big lumps in it. You want the soil to be fairly fine in texture, so if there's any big stones or twigs, you can remove them. You don't want your seeds to not be able to work through the soil. You want them to be able to germinate easily and push up through. So this is looking good. Now I need to put in my twine and my canes to make some nice straight rows. So here I've just put a cane in, a bamboo cane, and I've tied some twine to it to make a nice long length that I've attached to the other cane down here, and that just gives me a nice straight line for sowing my seeds along. Next I'm just going to mark along that line all the way down, just creating a small furrow, not too deep. And then what I'll do now is I will just water that before I put the seeds down. And I'm just going to water along the furrow, not round about it, because sometimes if you make your soil really wet everywhere, then that can attract slugs. So I'm just going to soak the bit I'm sowing in. I'll let that just soak in for a second, and then I'll get my seeds out. So I'm just going to be sowing some Phacelia seeds down here, and you can just pop them in, spacing them out as much as you can, but don't worry too much if one or two are beside each other. Phacelia don't need very high temperatures to germinate, so they'll germinate fairly quickly. Within 5 to 7 days I would suspect that we'll be seeing some Phacelia popping up. We'll check back on them and see how they're getting on. And Phacelia like darkness to germinate, so you can just cover them over with a little bit of soil. We won't need to water on top of this again because it's nice and moist underneath. There's a bit of a lump there, we'll remove that. So it's just a covering. Then make sure you label as well so that you know where you've planted your Phacelia, because we'll be taking this cane out in a minute and using it to make another row further along. So here's my label, I'm just going to pop it in there so that we know that that row's got Phacelia in it. And then we'll move on to sowing the next seeds that we're going to direct sow into the ground. After about a week, you'll start to see your Phacelia germinating as little seedlings, and at the beginning it'll just have its seed leaves on it, but when it starts to develop its true leaves and it's a couple of centimetres tall, you can start to thin your Phacelia out. So at that stage you can space them out to about 10 centimetres apart. And then when they are getting bigger still, a couple of weeks later, do it to the final spacing of about 30 centimetres apart, and then you can leave them to it after that. They might need a little watering in dry weather until they get established, but you shouldn't need to feed them, and they should get away for you really easily. So I'm going to take the twine out and the canes, and I'm going to make another row beside this Phacelia one. And my beds are 1 metre wide, so I will be able to fit 2 rows down my metre bed. And the reason for this is because I'm going to make about 30 centimetre spacing between the rows, but you have to remember that each plant as well will spread by about 30 centimetres. So that's why you can just fit 2 down that metre bed. So what kind of seeds do I direct sow into the ground? Well, a lot of the ones that I do are ones that are quick to germinate, so they'll do really well for me. They'll come on very quickly. So those are things like cornflowers and corn cockles. They are really good outside. Calendula is another one. So they're larger seeds, they're easy to put down the seed drills, cover them over, and then a week later you should start to get some germination. And these are, like I said before, seeds that I will already have started off indoors in earlier batches, but these later succession sowing batches I will be doing outside of these ones. And then there's some other seeds that really prefer to be started outside. I still do some indoors to overwinter them, just to hedge my bets really and make sure that I'll get some through the winter. But some things like Animagus, Dorcas, Nigella, they all have these really long tap roots on them and they don't really like being disturbed. So if you grow them indoors in seed trays, they germinate and then you pot them on maybe even twice over the winter time, or if you've sown them early on in the spring, they might need a couple of pottings on, and they don't like that. They resent that root disturbance. So they actually can do better for you from a direct sowing outside. You can sow them indoors, you just have to be extra careful when you are potting on, just to do as little damage to those roots as you possibly can. So that's a few of the different ones I do outside. Another ones that I do outside are things like the miniature snapdragons that you can get. So these are called Solenaria, and they are tiny little seeds, but they germinate very, very quickly, and they are great from a direct sowing outside. It's much, much easier to sow them in drills and thin them out than it is to have a lot of seeds all germinating in a seed tray, and there's just too many, it's too crowded, and it's very difficult to prick them out and pot them on. So those ones are better outside too. So I'm going to take you through and have a look at all of these different individual ones that do well outside for me just now. First up, we've got Nigella, which is a really good one to direct. So it has roots that don't like being disturbed. So if you are growing it indoors, you have to be very careful not to disturb the roots unduly, and it can get a little bit cross with getting potted on and transplanted out. So it will do really well from a direct sowing. I will start direct sowing it when we get to April time. I'll do a batch now, and then in about 3 weeks time I'll do another one, and then maybe one more final one later on in May, and that will give me flowers in July, August and September. Nigella is also a really good one for overwintering, so I will sow some seeds directly outside in late August, early September, and those will flower for me in the following late May, early June. Nigella should germinate for you outside from a direct sowing within a couple of weeks, and when you've got little seedlings established, you can thin them to about a 20 centimetre spacing. I found that you can actually plant Nigella fairly close together outside, so it doesn't need as much as a 30 centimetre spacing to get good flowers. So Dorcas is another excellent seed to sow directly once the weather starts to warm up a bit, and you need to keep sowing it every few weeks to get blooms all the way through the summer months. And I do start some off early on in trays in late February time, but actually my best Dorcas comes from the ones that I've directly sowed in the garden, and especially those that I have overwintered. So I'll direct sow some Dorcas when it gets to late August, September time, and then that'll overwinter in the ground outside, and it's brilliant at doing this. Dorcas seems to survive no matter what kind of weather we get, and then it'll flower earlier for me with bigger plants in late May into June. But if I sow it directly now in April time, now the weather's warmed up, it'll give flowers to me throughout July and August, which is great. And then I'll do another direct sowing in a few weeks time when we're getting to the end of April, beginning of May, and that'll help give me flowers through to September. So Dorcas, you can just cover lightly when you sow it direct outside, and you will find that it will come up germinating probably within about 12 to 16 days. And it doesn't mind slightly cooler temperatures to germinate either. It doesn't need to be really hot weather for it to come through. So that's really good if you're living in Scotland in a cooler climate as well. And I'll just put succession sowings on every few weeks now until we get to end of May, early June, and that'll give me flowers all summer long. So Gypsophila Covent Garden is another great one to sow direct outside now the weather is starting to warm up, and it will take about a week up to 3 weeks to germinate, so it just depends on the conditions really. It can sometimes be really quick and you'll get it within 7 days, and other times you might have to wait just a little bit longer. Now Gypsophila is something that if you're direct sowing it outside, you don't want to cover the seed. It likes to have light to germinate, so you just need to pre-water your furrow. Just put your Gypsophila seeds along it and then just make sure they're pressed lightly into the soil so they're in contact with some moisture, and they'll germinate there for you. So you may want to just lay some fleece or some netting directly over where you have sowed the Gypsophila, because they're just sitting on the surface and very easy for birds to get the seeds there. So just to protect them, you could add that extra layer on them just until the seedlings are through. Once you've got your little seedlings, you can then space them out to about 30 centimetres apart, and then once they are a few inches tall, you can pinch them out to create extra bushy plants with more flowers. Amimagus is a really good one to sow outdoors because it does resent getting its roots disturbed. It's got long roots on it, and they don't do quite so well if disturbed in their seed trays when they're getting potted on. So they like to grow directly outside. Now, I have tried overwintering Amimagus, and some years I'm successful and some years I'm not. So I will do some direct sowing in August, September time, and some years I'll get it through. But I also do grow some indoors just in case. And actually last winter it was so cold with the -15 temperatures that we got that actually I didn't get any Ami through outside or indoors. So it does just depend on your winter conditions. But on a good year it will overwinter really well for me outside, and when it does then I get the most massive plants in May with the most amazingly big flowers. So my best Amimagus has definitely come from a direct sowing in the autumn. That was definitely the best that I've ever had. Now you can sow Amimagus now outside as well. Now it's starting to warm up, and you can sow it every 3 weeks or so until the end of May. And you can just cover the seed lightly and it should germinate within about 2 to 3 weeks for you outside, and you can thin it to about 30 centimetre spacing after that. And it will germinate at slightly cooler temperatures as well, so it is a good one to start off fairly early in the spring outside. Solenaria Marokana is the most fantastic flower to direct sow outside when you've got to April time, and you can sow it right through in batches every few weeks until June, and it'll flower for you all summer long. And it quite enjoys cool climates, so Scotland is ideal for it, and it will flower away for you, and if you cut it for harvesting then it will rebloom again. And it's very easy to start from seed, but it is quite difficult to sow the seed thinly in your furrows because it's very tiny. So what you can do is you can mix it with some sand and then sow it that way, and that just helps to space it out a little bit. You can thin the flowers once they've come up to give them a bit more spacing. About 20 centimetres apart is ideal. And just like the Gypsophila, the Linaria is very similar in that you don't want to cover the seed when you sow it. It needs light to germinate. So just press the seed lightly into the damp soil, make sure it's got some contact with some moisture there, and it'll germinate for you. And like the Gypsophila, you might want to cover it with some netting or some fleece just until you've got some germination so the birds don't take away the seeds for you. Great cut flower though, so many bright colours that it comes in, and fantastic flower in a cooler climate like we are here in Zone 8B in Scotland. So Larkspur does really well from a direct sowing, but it does take quite a long time to get from sowing the seeds to flowering time. So you won't be putting on lots and lots of succession batches like you would with your Linaria, for example. And it's different as well to the Linaria. The Linaria liked to have some light to germinate, whereas the Larkspur likes darkness. So you'll be covering your seed when you sow it in your furrows outside. And it does like low temperatures to germinate, and it likes cool summers to flower best. So it is particularly suited to our climate here in Scotland and does really well for us. So for Larkspur, because it takes a while to get going, I would do some direct sowing now early on in April, and then I would get flowers later in the summer, and then I would do a direct sowing as well outside in late August, early September, with the hope of overwintering and then getting earlier flowers the following year. So corn cockles, they're something that we've talked about in the mini series that we've done recently, and they are fantastic flowers for direct sowing. Very robust for overwintering, probably my most robust flower in the garden. And I'll start off as seed sowing direct outside in late August, early September time, and they will overwinter really well for me and start flowering in May the following year. But I'll also start off some batches direct sowing outside in April time. They only need fairly cool temperatures to germinate and will germinate very quickly within a week to 2 weeks for you. When you direct sow them outside, you can cover the seed, that's absolutely fine. And when you've got your little seedlings up, you can thin them to 20 to 30 centimetres apart. And then I'll keep doing some batch sowings every few weeks until we get to the end of May. And that'll give me corn cockle flowers all summer long. Cornflowers are a really good one to direct sow outside as well. Again, they'll overwinter really well for you from a direct sowing. So you can start one off in late August and September time. And they are very robust at getting through most winters. You can also start to do batches now, so again in April time put them on and they will germinate for you very quickly within a week to 2 weeks. When you sow them direct outside, you can just cover the seed, so up to 1 centimetre of covering on top of them. They're quite large seeds, so it's quite easy to space them out in your rows outside. And I'll probably do another couple of batches now. So I'll do one just now, maybe one the end of April and then one mid-May. And that will do me for a season full of cornflowers. And then I'll start them again once we get to late August time. So calendula are another great flower that you can direct sow, and calendula actually come in a lot of different colours. The traditional orange that you might be used to isn't the only one that you can get. You can also get some other ones. I've tried sunset buff before, which is really nice. And calendula, like the corn cockles and cornflowers, will germinate very, very quickly for you. And you just need to sow them in rows where you thinly cover them, and you can space them out to up to 30 centimetres once you've got little seedlings. And you can do a couple of succession sowings throughout the season to make sure that you have got calendula all the way through up to autumn time. And then we've got Phacelia, which I showed you earlier on in the video, me direct sowing outside. So another great one to do. It is another one that you can overwinter really easily. So you can put some batches on in late August, September time, and it will give lovely flowers for you in May next year. And then you can also do lots of succession sowings just now over the coming weeks. Now, Phacelia will flower for you very, very quickly within 6 to 8 weeks, so you can fit in a lot of different succession sowings. And you need to remember that it will flower only for about 6 weeks, so you do need to put repeat batches on. So every 2 to 3 weeks, up until end of May, I will be putting on new batches of Phacelia outside. Like we showed you before, just cover the seeds outside, make sure they're in a damp furrow that you've made for them, lightly cover them over, and you will get very quick germination within a week to 2 weeks. And then you'll get some very quick flowering plants from that. So lots of lovely flowers for you to try direct sowing outside in your garden. They all look fantastic, either just to look at in your garden or to use as a cut flower on your flower farm. And there's definitely a gradual shift now from doing a lot of indoor sowing in February, March time to now going on to direct sowing outside, which definitely helps to save a lot of time and can give you some really super flowers as well. So thanks very much for watching today's video. I hope you found it interesting seeing when there are situations that I do some direct sowing, and it can be really successful if you take the right precautions and get it started at the right time, and it certainly makes things a lot easier once you're well into the growing season and you're getting really busy. Just avoiding all of that seed sowing into trays, potting on and pricking out and hardening off and planting out in the soil. It is a lot easier to do some direct sowing. If you're enjoying my videos at the moment, it would be great if you could like and subscribe. It's fantastic to have you with me and sharing your growing stories and how you're getting on as the season gets going in 2023. We'll be back in the next couple of weeks because we're going to be looking at the tulips because they're just on the brink of coming out. I've got the first ones just showing some buds now. So in a week's time, I think it'll just suddenly all go and they'll all be coming out, and it'll be harvesting several times a day to get them at the right stage. So join me then.